Hello, chemistry students. Today we're going to be performing our volumetric analysis of bleach experiment. So the purpose of this experiment is to introduce you to volumetric analysis by determining the percent sodium hypochlorite in a commercial bleach solution. Let's get started. Okay, so I've gone ahead and set up a burette which is secured to our equipment stand using a burette clamp. I've already gone ahead and previously washed our burette with deionized water. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to take 5 milliliters of our standard solution, which is 0.100 molar sodium thiosulfate. We want to make sure that our stopcock is in the closed position on our burette. We're going to use a funnel, so we'll insert the funnel in the top of the burette. And then we're going to take 5 milliliters of our standard solution, the sodium thiosulfate, and add it to our burette. We're then going to remove the funnel, take the burette off the equipment stand, and we're going to rinse the inner walls of our burette with our standard solution. This is going to remove any traces of water that might have been left when we washed our burette with deionized water earlier. Then we're going to dump out our wash. Make sure you close the stopcock. Reinsert your burette in the burette clamp. We're then going to take 100 milliliters of our standard solution, again, the 0.1000 molar sodium thiosulfate, and transfer it into a 250 milliliter beaker. And then we're going to use our funnel again, and we're going to fill our burette with our standard solution. We next want to open our stopcock, allowing the solution to drain out into a waste beaker until the tip of the burette is filled. We want to make sure that we remove any bubbles from the tip of our burette. I'm going to go ahead and open the stopcock. You can see how we removed the bubbles. So now we can go ahead and close it. And now we will record the reading to the 0.01 mark on the burette. Our burette will then be prepared to start the titration. You now need to record the reading to the 0.01, and our burette is now prepared to start the titration. Okay, so we first need to label 2 Erlenmeyer flasks, Erlenmeyer flask number 1, and Erlenmeyer flask number 2. We're then going to use a 100 ml graduated cylinder to add 100 milliliters of deionized water to Erlenmeyer flask number 1. And we're going to use a 10 milliliter graduated cylinder to add 10 milliliters of 10% potassium iodide solution also to Erlenmeyer flask number 1. And we'll swirl to mix. And then we're going to repeat the same procedure for Erlenmeyer flask number 2. We're now going to add 100 milliliters of deionized water to Erlenmeyer flask number 2. And 10 milliliters of our 10% potassium iodide solution also to Erlenmeyer flask number 2. And we'll swirl to mix. We're next going to create our dilute bleach solution. So the commercial bleach solution that we're going to be using today is chlorine. Its density is 1.075 grams per mil, and the price of this is $2.99 for 3.57 liters. And this is all right here. This bottle just contains an aliquot of the commercial bleach solution inside of it. We're now going to pipette 5 milliliters of our commercial bleaching solution to a 100 milliliter volumetric flask. This is our 100 milliliter volumetric flask. And we're going to do this using an analytical pipette or a volumetric pipette. And this is our 5 milliliter volumetric pipette. So we will fill to the mark on the pipette with commercial bleaching solution. We'll then dilute our commercial bleaching solution that we just added to our 100 milliliter volumetric flask with deionized water. So we've diluted our commercial bleaching solution with deionized water. Now we're going to cover our 100 milliliter volumetric flask with parafilm, and we will invert to mix. This is the diluted bleach solution that we will be using. We're now going to transfer 25 milliliters of our diluted bleach solution in our 100 ml volumetric flask using an analytical pipette. So this is our 25 milliliter analytical pipette or volumetric pipette. And we're going to transfer 25 milliliters of our diluted bleach solution. We are also going to add 4 milliliters of 6 molar hydrochloric acid using a 10 milliliter graduated cylinder. I've already gone ahead and added the 4 milliliters of hydrochloric acid. And this will also be transferred to Erlenmeyer flask number 1. We will then swirl the flask to mix. And immediately after mixing, we're going to start titration using flask number 1. This is our initial volume in the burette. Make sure to record the initial volume on your data sheet to the correct number of significant figures. Note that we are just over 2.5 milliliters, but you need to have the correct number of significant figures. We're now going to immediately titrate Erlenmeyer flask number 1 after mixing. We'll first add 2 milliliters of sodium thiosulfate from the burette into the flask while we swirl to mix the flask. Next, we will dropwise add 1 milliliter of 1% starch solution to the titration flask until the mixture develops a blue color. Remember, we're adding this dropwise with mixing. Note our color change after the addition of the 1% starch solution. We now have a dark color. We're now going to continue our titration, adding sodium thiosulfate solution from the burette until we reach the endpoint. The endpoint for this titration is just until the blue color disappears. So our solution is starting to become lighter in color. We are nearing the endpoint of our titration. You can see that our solution has just become clear. That is the endpoint of this titration. We now need to record the final burette reading. This is the final reading on our burette after reaching the endpoint for trial number 1 of our titrations. Note that it is just over 13 milliliters, but be sure to record the correct number of significant figures. We're now going to prepare Erlenmeyer flask number 2 for trial number 2. So again, we need to transfer 25 milliliters of our diluted bleach solution using an analytical pipette. And again, we have our 25 milliliter analytical pipette or volumetric pipette. And we're going to transfer 25 milliliters of our diluted bleach solution and we're transferring 25 milliliters of our diluted bleach solution to Erlenmeyer flask number 2. We will also add 4 milliliters of our 6 molar hydrochloric acid to Erlenmeyer flask number 2. And I've already measured out the 4 milliliters of hydrochloric acid using a 10 milliliter graduated cylinder. We'll add this to Erlenmeyer flask number 2. And then we will gently swirl the flask to mix. We will now immediately begin the trial number 2 titration. This is the initial volume of the burette for trial number 2. Be sure to record this initial volume on your data sheet to the correct number of significant figures. Note that it is just slightly over 13 milliliters. We're immediately starting titration of trial number 2. So we're going to first slowly add 2 milliliters of our sodium thiosulfate solution from the burette into the flask with swirling. We're now going to dropwise add 1 milliliter of our starch solution to the titration flask for trial number 2 until the mixture develops a dark blue color. Remember to do this dropwise. Note that our color is starting to change, but we want to get to the point that we have a dark blue color. We now have our dark blue color, so we're going to continue the titration, adding sodium thiosulfate solution from the burette until the endpoint. The endpoint for this titration again is just until the blue color disappears. Our blue color is starting to get lighter, so we are nearing the endpoint of our titration. We still have a very faint blue color, so we need about another half drop from the burette. Our solution in Erlenmeyer flask number 2 is now clear, so we have reached the endpoint of our titration for trial number 2. This is the final volume reading on the burette for trial number 2. Note that the volume appears to be just over 23.8 milliliters, but you need to make sure that you record the correct number of significant figures on your data sheet. This concludes trial number 2. Please empty your burette into your waste beaker and discard waste from your beakers and flasks into the waste container in the hood. So using our titrations, you should be able to determine the percent sodium hypochlorite in our commercial bleach solution. This concludes the volumetric analysis of bleach experiment. Thank you for joining me for this laboratory.